My bullet journal setups are usually very fairy tale and fantasy inspired, but I've had this idea stuck in my head for some time. A bold, bright, simplistic layout that draws on elements of history. For July in my bullet journal, we're getting a bit Gatsby with an Art Deco theme. Hi, it's Erin, and I spent so long cutting the elements for this setup with my Cricut, I can't even describe how long it took. This is my very first monthly setup in my new journal. This one is the Gold Vintage Journal in blue from TIEFOSSI. And usually my setups involve a lot of stuff from a lot of places. I like to use lots of different little bits and pieces that look nice together, but for this one, I'm just going with this navy paper, which is just printer paper from Officeworks. It was very cheap, it's 90 GSM, one black fine liner, and all of my Cricut cut elements in gold vinyl. And that's it. I didn't even use a brush pen. I had a really clear image in my head for how I thought this would turn out, and I'm actually pretty happy to say that it's ended up very close to that vision, so I'm very happy with where this layout is headed. I quite often turn to my channel members when I need help deciding on the elements of a layout or the piece of stationery that will inspire it, or in this case, which era of history I should draw my inspiration from. The two options I gave in the poll were for Art Deco and Art Nouveau. Technically Art Nouveau won the poll, but a few people pointed out that July in the Mystery Journal, which I posted recently, has a fair bit of an Art Nouveau flavour already, and it would be cool to go with Art Deco. And part of what inspired this idea for me in the first place was that I saw one of my old themes from June 2021 where I did an Art Deco theme, and I looked at it and thought, I think I could do that so much better now. So, challenge accepted. I've taken all of the elements I'm using in this theme from a combination of Canva and from Cricut Design Space, but I will say a lot of the Canva elements I chose I really liked the look of, but for the size I needed them for the journal ended up not being viable. They were much too delicate, and cutting them and then weeding them with a little hooky tool to get the gaps out of the vinyl, it wasn't going to work. I don't actually pay for a Cricut Access subscription, but I do have the trial of it at the moment, so I'm kind of just milking it while I have it. But I will say if you're interested in doing a similar project that it is always safer to go with the Cricut elements from within Design Space because they have been designed to be cut by the machine. So yeah, that's always helpful. This cover page was done with Canva though. I put all of the elements in place within Canva, so it cut this all in one go for me, and I didn't have to try and get my alignment right or anything. It was just always going to be the perfect cover page because I sized it to exactly the dimensions of an A5 page. When you're working with the Cricut vinyl, the way they recommend to use it is to put this transfer tape over the top and burnish it with something hard and plasticky to get the design to stick to the clear layer, and then place that clear layer down on whatever surface that you're working with and burnish it down again to transfer it onto the paper. If you are planning to do this, I really recommend, I showed a little bit of it earlier, sticking the transfer tape to another surface a bunch of times first to get rid of some of the stickiness, because otherwise it will rip up your paper, and it might still rip it up a little bit anyway. Some parts of mine, especially the blue paper that I'm using for the accent color, did cop it a little bit, but not so much that it's going to affect my use of the setup, which is nice. I stuck it to my desk mat, I stuck it to the front of my journal, and I stuck it to my pants a bunch of times, so once it had a nice layer of fluff and cat hair on it, things were working much better. It's exactly what you want, actually. Unlike the July cover page, this little quote here, which is obviously from The Great Gatsby, what else are we going to take a quote from if we're doing an Art Deco theme? This quote was one of the things I had designed within Canva that didn't work once I cut it with my Cricut, so I had to go back and do it again with an Art Deco font that is within Cricut Design Space to make it work, because some of the lines were just too thin and too skinny and they would just rip as you were peeling things off, and it wasn't going to work out for me at all, so this was one of the areas I had to change tack, which is why this is not a fully designed page in one go like the previous one. So alongside all of my page headers and all of my quotes and cover spreads and things that I wanted to cut, I made sure I did some random little decorative elements as well that I could use almost like how I would normally use a sticker, so that I could arrange them into something like this whenever necessary. I haven't included any of the cutting with the Cricut machine in this video, nor very much of the weeding process, which is where you rip up all of the vinyl that goes around your design so that you only are left with the design that you want to use. It would have been a really long video if I'd included that, because the cutting process actually took an hour and 25 minutes just on its own, and then weeding took an entire afternoon just on its own as well, but I have captured some of that to go into this month's vlog, which is going to be my next video after this one. So if you're interested in a bit of behind the scenes on this setup, look forward to my next video and make sure you're subscribed. One idea I had that I was so excited about for this setup was the idea of layering a repeating pattern over the top of a solid block of this blue paper. And I think that's worked so well here. Of course, I wanted it on the cover spread, so I've done a little Dutch door so it's visible there, but it's also decoration for the calendar spread, which is the one we're going to set up now. There's going to be a lot more negative space in this setup than typically you'll see in mine. I was just feeling, I don't want to say minimalist because I do feel like this was a fairly decadent era in history and I think the art style is really beautiful, but maybe minimalist for me, you know? I've sized the calendar pretty specifically to fit into the space that was left over once you take up one side of the right page with some decoration and removing the left side of the left page. So the calendar boxes this time are 4 dot grid spaces wide by 5 dot grid spaces tall, which is a bit taller than I usually do. When it comes to individual letter stickers, like I'm doing at the top of the calendar here, you can just peel those ones off the backing paper with tweezers and place them down as you like, instead of using the transfer tape, because that would get really frustrating and fiddly if you're just transferring one little thing at a time. It's definitely more useful for larger designs or for things that have multiple pieces that you want to move all in one go. A little bit of foreshadowing. As I was setting this up, I kept coming across areas where I wished I had just a little something extra. So we will come back to each of the pages and just zhuzh things a little bit more towards the end of the video. But for now, we'll just move through using the things that I had because I had to cut some more elements to do that. The previous Art Deco theme that I did back in 2021 was very different to this one. I kind of just used what I had. At the time I wasn't using stickers, so I drew everything. I did all of the lettering myself. I tried to do lots of lines with gel pens and things got smudged, and I remember getting really frustrated with it actually. That video is still up on my channel, but watch it at your own peril because I wasn't very good at voiceover yet then. There's lots of and really audible thinking and it's a little frustrating to listen to, so just know that going in. Apologies in advance if you do watch it. I had the vision for that one, and indeed for this setup that we're doing right now as well, to have the accent colour be a deep kind of hunter green, similar to the jumper I'm wearing in this video. You can see the sleeves. That's the colour I wanted. Apparently it does not exist. I looked for wrapping paper, I looked for washi tape, I looked for printer paper. The closest I could find was this deep navy blue, which is really lovely and definitely works, and I'm very happy with it, but I don't understand why I couldn't find any like deep, dark emerald green paper anywhere, or washi tape, or anything. So my sleeves are an homage to the theme that I wanted to make, and I also don't own a navy blue jumper, so we work with what we've got. We're moving on to my monthly, let's call this aspirational spread. I have the pages in my theme pretty well nailed down at the moment. They're all really useful and working really well for me. This one has evolved a little bit over the course of the year. To start with, it was just goals, favorites, and working on, and I've added the anticipating section for anything I'm looking forward to. I've decided to divide the page into 4 this time and add the headings for each of these vertically on some blue. So that's going to get the blue element onto the page. It's going to make sure everything has space to still be functional. The headings themselves are going to act as dividers in the vertical orientation, and I had a handy little divider element that I could use for the horizontal as well. That straight-edged paper cutter is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for this theme because it's making sure I get right angles and straight lines and then everything looks nice and uniform, which is absolutely what you want in a situation like this. On the facing page is my habit tracker, which is just a table with space to track 6 habits for the month. Since there are 31 days in July, you really need most of the page vertically to do this, because there are 38 dot grid spaces tall in an A5 journal like this one, so I decided to just make it take up the whole page space, and then it would kind of mirror the vertical lines of the facing page on the left. I've tucked it right in next to the binding, right in the middle of the book there, so I can use the space on the right side for another solid block of decoration, similar to what I did back on the calendar page underneath the Dutch door. I wasn't totally sure how I was going to approach this repeating pattern system, so when I cut it with the Cricut, I actually just did a whole A5 page worth of it, and I'm cutting that down as I need. Something I hadn't considered when I was getting really excited about this wall of decoration system was where I was going to put the heading for this page. Sorry about my head leaning into frame here. I really had to get directly above the elements sometimes to see what I was doing in this setup. It was quite precise, and so that was a bit more important than usual. What I ended up doing was removing some of the pattern element from the gold repeating pattern vinyl and allowing that space to be where the habit heading sat instead. And I think it looks really cool and seamless once it's done. That's this spread done, so we're going to turn the page and move on to the next one. This is the routine spread, and this one's going to have more of that repeated pattern element on it because I'm just having such a good time with it. I'm going to do it horizontally this time though, and use the space in the middle of the spread for my functional area. I've talked about this a little bit in the past when setting up my routine spread, but it is really what it sounds like. It's a place for me to try and refine and work on my routine. I did not have a routine for a really long time. I've been self-employed for a really long time, and I continue to be, but I have hit a point in my life now where I feel like some stability and routine would be really nice. So I've been trying to work out, after not having a routine for so long, what works for me. And this spread is helping me learn about myself. I still wouldn't say that I have a routine locked in, but I'm starting to get somewhere. I usually rely quite heavily on penciling out all of my lines and markings for my setups ahead of time, but once you're sticking vinyl down over something, it's going to be very difficult to erase the pencil lines from underneath it. So I tried to get a bit creative with this little fleur-de-lis journal clip that I got recently from JOURNALSAY because it has a very definitive center point on it. So I'm lining that up with the center whenever I need to position something there, and it worked really well. I've divided this spread into 4 sections. On the left page, we'll have space to add my current working morning and weekly routines, and on the right, we'll have a section for reflection. That's what's working and what's not. I'm going to orient these ones vertically like we did back on the goals and anticipating etc. spread, because that way I thought it would really tie those elements in, having a little bit more of this vertical orientation. It's also going to make everything fit a lot better because that what's working title was not going to fit horizontally in that space. I'm also learning as I go that when I'm using a larger sheet of transfer tape like this, I have lots of elements that are all different sizes, so rather than lots of separate bits of transfer tape, I'm just using the same pieces over and over. I've really only got 2 on the go. But using the backing from some of the pieces I've already laid down in earlier pages over the top of the page so that not too much of the transfer tape that isn't being used sticks to the page means that there's a lot less opportunity for the page to rip up when I'm peeling it off, and that's really helpful. So that's a good thing to remember. Masking off your page is a good idea. I have a second A5 page here of the repeating pattern again, so I'm going to cut it to the sizes that it needs to be to fill where the blue paper is on this spread. It is much more difficult to cut this horizontally. It doesn't make as clean a cut, and I found that it was tearing up some of the vinyl and just kind of bending it rather than cutting it, so I'm going to cut the second 2 by hand. And I'm trying my best to match up the pattern so they'll be somewhat continuing from the left page onto the right, but I'm also not being super precious about it because I don't think your eye will be that aware if it's a little bit off. I think the overall effect will still be there. I will also say that by this point I was beginning to experience some severe transfer tape fatigue. I've sped everything up so it's not infuriating to watch, but it really does take a long time to do all of this stuff when you're working with the transfer tape. So for these sections, I decided to just peel them off by hand and stick them down with the good old eyeball method, and I think it worked pretty well. The cut design is actually a little bit longer than the space, so I had to trim it down with scissors a little bit to make it really fit, but I think it worked just as well because this is all just one piece of vinyl. This routine's header was a bit of a tricky one because it has an uneven number of letters in it, but I wanted it to go across the center of the spread, which means it would go through the binding. What I ended up doing was cutting it right down the middle of the letter T and then removing some of the pattern again, just like we did on the previous page, so there'd be a little bit of space for it to sit into at the top. I probably could have taken a little bit longer planning how much space I needed here and cutting this section out because I ended up not leaving quite enough room and having to cut a little bit more off once it was already stuck down to the blue paper, but all's well that ends well, it still turned out pretty cute. Routine spread is done, so let's turn the page and move on to my content planner. You could be forgiven for thinking this was a weekly spread, but it's actually a bit of a weird take on a weekly where instead of 1 week's worth of dates on here, I've got all of the Tuesdays and all of the Fridays across the course of July, and that's because those are the days that I post my videos on YouTube. The top row is all of the Tuesdays, the bottom row is all of the Fridays, and because it's a little bit wonky for the month of July because there is one more Tuesday than Friday in this equation, I've decided to fill in that gap with a little bit of my blue paper, and I'm going to cap the left side of the setup with some more of the paper as well and use those as my decorative areas as well as where I pop down my heading. This was probably my least thought out and maybe my least favorite of all of the spreads in this setup, just because it was a little bit of an awkward one to make functional as well as pretty, but I think it worked out okay in the end. This is actually one of the spreads we'll make quite a few changes to when we come back with some extra freshly cut elements towards the end of the video. I think you can tell I was starting to get pretty tired at this point and really sick of using the transfer tape because I placed this content planner header right aligned to the right side of this box, and I thought I'm just going to fill in the rest of the gaps with whatever little bits of decoration that I've got lying around, and this one ended up pretty disjointed. I didn't have enough of my repeating pattern to do another panel of that, so I didn't want to go and cut another one without knowing what else I might need at this stage. So I ended up just adding this divider and another one of those little brackets like we had back on the cover spread around some of the text. And I went, do you know what? That'll do. Let's just call it a day right there. I had also cut the headers to go into each of these individual spaces as well, like the Tuesday and Friday and the dates, but I'd cut them too small. Those were one of the casualties from my not very well planned use of a font that wasn't from Cricut. I actually made headers for all of my weeklies in a different style for each weekly, and then none of them really worked out very well, but that meant I could harvest the boxes from these failed weekly headers and use them on this spread instead. So I'm just taking the box element, the outside part. I'm not using the numbers here because those were not actually intended for this spread. I'm just going to leave them where they are and not use them because they're not very good anyway. Unfortunately, this not actually being a weekly, I only had 8 of these cut, one for the 7 days and one for a note section, so I'm gonna have to cut one more, but I'm making a note of it and we'll come back. Onward to our last spread, and this one is going to be a weekly. I like to set these ones up in a couple of different sessions over the course of the month, and when I have the bandwidth, I will do them on a live stream with you guys if you're keen to, so keep an eye out for that. I have missed quite a few, but I did do one recently for June, so I'm trying to get back on the bandwagon. This is just going to be the first weekly for July, and it's going to include the Monday the 30th from June as well, because I like to have my weeks complete in my weeklies. I will massage that a little bit for the mystery journal because that journal's not for me, but in my own journal, I like to have Monday to Sunday together. I've been doing a lot of weekly spread research lately because I have just recently finished setting up the mystery journal for the second half of the year, so that meant doing 6 months worth of weeklies in a really quick turnaround. And I came across this one on Instagram. It's wild that I hadn't seen it before because it's so beautiful, it's absolutely perfect, and I would have been using the heck out of it if I'd found it earlier. I dug it up on Instagram when I was searching the weekly spread tag on the account of Art by Adobe. Her post is actually from 2021, so this one's been up there for a while just waiting for me to find it. But I've modified it a bit, so I've made the left side just all decoration rather than having any tiny calendars or anything. And of course, I went ahead and made some squares with some Art Deco frames to make this really fit the theme. I didn't want to have a note section on this weekly, so rather than including one square for decoration right in the middle of the setup, I've decided to have 2 squares for decoration that are in the middle of the left and the right columns, and then I'll just have the middle section just have one little Thursday right there, and I think that's going to work really well. I added the blue in the background for our non-functional squares. Those are the ones that are just for decoration. And I started out by trying to peel these ones up by hand and just place them on the page, but unfortunately these squares do work best when they are on the transfer tape, so I'm just going to commit to it for the rest of them. Since the weekly cuts I made the first time around didn't work, I've gone ahead and used the font that is within Cricut Design Space to make all of my headings for each of my weeklies for the whole month. And I'm just going to stick those down with tweezers because these ones, although they're separate stickers, you could put them on the transfer tape. I figure this isn't too different to just having a sheet of stickers and sticking them all down individually anyway, so I decided to just freestyle it for this one. Also, in case you hadn't noticed, I did choose 2 different designs for the squares for these weekly boxes that I will do my planning in, and I arranged them sort of like a noughts and crosses design, so you've got a little tic-tac-toe through the middle there. Isn't that cute? I thought that was a cute touch. I've decided I can't get enough of my repeating pattern over the top of the solid blue, so I'm going to line this outside edge of the page with that once again, but I don't have another one of those cut, and I don't have enough left over from the ones that I cut previously, so I went ahead and made some new elements to polish off the rest of this setup. I decided I wanted a big frame that goes all the way around the content planner and one to go around the calendar as well. I cut some more. Actually, I just used the same file as before for those little squares, so I'd have one more, and now I'll have a few more to play with just in case. But this weeding job takes some time, so I thought I'd just show you. This is very sped up. It can take quite a while to get all the extra vinyl off the designs, the parts that you actually want to use. I remember when I was first setting up the Cricut, there was a section of its welcome package where it tells you that most people find weeding, which is what this process is called, really relaxing. I can't relate. I am not one of those people, unfortunately, but I get it if you do. Like, it seems kind of like coloring in, which is, funnily enough, despite the fact that I like doing this stuff, not something I enjoy either. I recut some slightly larger versions of the initials and the numbers for the content planner here, so I know what I'm looking at when I'm actually using this spread. I've had this gold vinyl in my stash for some time, ever since I got my Cricut, and I've actually used up almost all of it on this project, which is kind of wild. I'd obviously used a fair chunk previously because I've had the Cricut for like 3 years, but if you just chuck all of the elements into Design Space and tell it to cut, it would have put nothing inside the frame, so I had to be a bit creative about how I cut these things so I wouldn't run out of gold while I was still midway through the project. And I'm not too sure how I'm going to go about the weeklies because of this, honestly. I might have to get me some more gold vinyl, but I've proven to myself that I'll use it, so I think it's worth it. I felt like this page needed just a little bit of something extra, so I cut some little right angles that I'm just popping in the corners of each of these planning spaces. That's not going to take up any of the space that I would have written in, but it just gives it a little something. I put the ones on the top oriented so that they were on the top, and the ones on the bottom oriented so they're on the bottom. Almost as though they're implying a frame without having to be the whole frame. One thing that was really handy about knowing the size of the space that I wanted my repeating pattern to go into this time was that I could just cut enough to fit in that space. I didn't need to do any excess, and as a result, I've ended up with a lot less weeding to do, but this is still quite a process, this one, and my hand got really tired, my knuckles got really tired. I am the kind of person who accidentally squeezes whatever utensil they're writing with at any given time, so this really does hurt your hand if you try to do too much in one go. But the end result is so impactful, I absolutely think it was worth it. And this has almost made me want to try my hand at making some cards for my friends for special occasions. I think that could be really nice. I sort of hadn't proven to myself what I could do with this stuff, and now that I know, I'm like, ooh, that was really fun. Once again, eschewing the transfer tape in favor of just peeling this up with my fingers. There were a few casualties this time, but that's okay because I can just replace them with some tweezers, and hopefully you won't even be able to tell. Alright, let's flip back and try to add these big frames in, and this I didn't approach very well at all. I didn't really check that when I scaled the frames, because of their Art Deco corners kind of cutting into the space, that they would actually fit the pages I wanted to apply them to. So I ended up butchering them a little bit, partly just so that I could wrangle them onto the page in the first place, but also so that they would fit around the elements without covering anything I'd already put down. It required a bit of a hack job of vinyl surgery, but we got there in the end somewhat. This one for the content planner is fine, I guess. It's a little bit gappy. We'll do a better job on the one that goes on the calendar page, I promise. Didn't have a whole lot of room on the left side of the calendar though to put the 2 layers there, so I've kind of reversed them for that left side. There's supposed to be a thin strip and then a thicker strip of the vinyl, but I've ended up just sticking the thicker one down and not having much room left for anything else. It's okay, we'll work with what we've got. But now that all those elements are down on the page, we've actually finished my July setup in this Art Deco style for 2025. And could it be? Is this one of my favorite setups I've ever done? I think it might be. It's quite different to my usual style, but I enjoyed myself so much, and I hope you enjoyed seeing something a little bit different from me too. Never fear, lovers of Art Nouveau, I do still eventually plan to do a theme with that, kind of maybe in this vein in the future, but I might leave it a little while because I am sick of transfer tape at this point. Just in case an Art Deco vibe is not your jam, here's a link to July in the Mystery Journal, also for 2025, which is a much more fairy tale themed setup. And if you're looking for even more inspo, underneath that is a playlist of all of my bullet journal setups in my own journal from the entire year.